this is part of the strategy to contain China. The writing is very clear that China is rising very rapidly, and it is becoming an alternative to U.S. hegemony. And the rise of China is very different from the rise of Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was much more contained. Its role in the international sphere was very different in the realm of politics.
Let's maybe move on now with our discussion and talk a little bit more also about your work on your own channel, the global left perspective that you're trying to bring in. And your channel is about to reach 100,000 subscribers, and you've been hosting a wide variety of guests and thinkers. Where is this? What's your driving motivation, and which perspectives are you most interested in?
We have always been interested in a global dialogue, given we live in a globalized world, and it is the big corporations, the big um, business people who have become whose voices have become much more globalized. And in some ways, the irony is the left, which is generally speaking more internationalist, has lost these spaces. So that's one of our motivation to establish global dialogue where we can dislodge our national and nationalist frameworks and think about justice from a more neutral perspective, or what Adam Smith would have called the impartial spectator. So that's one of the goals. Of course, India is important given it's the most populous country, given we have very few progressive in media from India that focus on global politics. So even the few that do, they are not progressive, and they effectively don't intervene in global politics. What they do is they intervene in global talks through Indian nationalist position. So that's the center of the few media outlets from India that even focus on global politics. So we thought there is a huge gap there to be filled in. In terms of talking to wide range of people, we consider ourselves to be a part of for the lack of a better word, the progressive alternative media, which challenges mainstream narratives, and so we don't consider ourselves to be alone in this. And so what we try to do is we track most of the progressive outlets and what they do, and we try to add something new to that. Of course, sometimes we have to rely on the same faces because there is the market conditions, the algorithms, and accessibility where you need to bring similar voices. But even if we bring same voices, we try to ask different questions, not because we think our questions are the most important, but because we think that that would add a different perspective to this shared space, which we consider ourselves a part of. Um, yeah, I think that's where we are at, and yeah.
I want to come back to this interview you did with John Mearsheimer, because one of the things that I liked very much is that you pushed back. I mean, you focused on a point that I believe John Mearsheimer, who again I must say is a person I respect very highly because I perceive him as very intellectually honest in the way that he sticks to his theories, and also that he has the courage, for instance, to write an entire book and stand behind the Israel lobby. I mean, this just deserves a lot and a lot of praise. But at the same time, he seems to have this somewhat blind spot when it comes to China or to India, which you were working on, and pushed him on. What was your main takeaway from that discussion you had with him?
Yeah, I think the key point on that section, I mean, it was a long interview covering different segment, but the segment you were talking about, I think the key difference is this. Um, does the presence of the United States in Asia create a larger polarization that escalates border conflicts or disputed territorial conflicts into a much bigger conflict of strategic interests? Or is it that these Asian states are not acceptable to each other, perpetually at war with each other, and it is the United States that comes in and try to create some effectively a policing order in the region? And I think we took two different positions. Our position was that, and we discussed some of the cases. We discussed India and China. We discussed the Taiwan case, which is completely different. And we briefly discussed Japan, but we were not able to go into great detail. Um, but our position is that even if uh, China and Japan has have conflicts over the Senkaku Islands or Oahu Islands, um, uh, that doesn't mean that they can coexist. What is a bigger impediment is the stationing of 50,000 troops at Okinawa, at multiple other bases in Japan. And it's not just Japan. It's in Korea. It's going all the way down into Philippines, including Guam, and or even down in Thailand. There are multiple bases that the United States maintain, which contains more than 100,000 in United States armed personnel, and that is creating huge encirclement, and that is escalating these conflicts. And the reason we say that is that in Central Asia, where the United States footprints is much lower, and which were used to be equally contentious, China and the Central Asian states have been able to resolve those disputes much more peacefully. Um, and Professor Mearsheimer, had a different view. He thinks that somehow these Asian states cannot manage their conflict on their own. And so the United States should be there as a police state. And that would also lead to his idea of containing China. And I was never fully able to understand why does he think that China should be contained and not the United States, even if by his theory that the great powers would always conflict. Why is it the United States not to be contained rather than the other way around? I mean, except from a nationalist cause. I was never able to understand. But that was, as I see, was the crux of our conflict.
Yeah, if I understand him correctly, then his answer would probably be that no, if China had the power, it would try to contain the United States, but because it doesn't, it's in the United States' best interest. But th this is where I disagree with him as
But
well,
why
and
do we
where.
favor? But
Hmm?
then the question is, why do we favor the United States? I mean, even if that's another piece of the debate, there is no evidence that China would try to contain. Forget United States. I mean, look at the history of
Yeah.
Japan and China. I mean, in 1,000 years of history, China never conquered Japan. Japanese expansion goes way back into 1590s, and then massively from 1894 when the Sino-Japanese War led to Japanese takeover of Taiwan, China. Then again in 1931, it invaded northeast China, took over Manchuria, and established the Manchukuo. Again, it invaded in 1937. And then we entered the era of Cold War, where it was directly absorbed into the part of the US empire. So that's a different discussion whether we have any evidence that China would try to contain. But my question is, even if there is an evidence, there is no evidence. I don't think that would happen. We are living at an age of extreme nationalism. I mean, imagine talks about taking over an airport in Uganda because some of the debt payments were unable to be returned, led to massive uproar against it, and the Chinese had to back down. And you think about China invading Japan. I mean, it's just ridiculous beyond belief to even think about that in this age of hyper-nationalism. But the question remains that even if you thought that China would try to contain United States, why is it a right position to say that we should favor United States containing China rather than China containing United States? I have to say that you have to have two lines of argument. Either you say that I am nationalist, or I mean American nationalist, or you say that I feel the U.S. system is better than the Chinese system.
And yeah, and
And, and
don't
I think it's weak on either ground.
no, no, and don't get me wrong. I mean, I don't share that point of his.
Of course, of course.
Um what I believe is that he doesn't think about it in terms of which one is better or worse, but which one out of the power dynamics makes most sense for those states. So it's not. I don't think it's a moral prescription. I think it's that he said that he thinks this is the most rational way for the United States to approach China, because not engaging with China from his theory isn't possible for a great power. So somehow you need to interact, right? I mean, it's unthinkable that these two completely, stop and seize all and any connections. But the blind spot I do see is also that the way that this was framed, right, as China's rise being ultimately a mistake of United States foreign policy of letting China rise. This is
Mhm.
this is something that I also encounter a lot in Europe, and I just wonder about your view on that. That the Europeans and Euro Americans, they see everything as a factor, an outcome of their doing. Can can India and China and others maybe at some point push back against this perception?
I mean, they've been pushing back against this perception. I mean, there is a long history of that, starting from anti-colonial resistance movements and so on. And even after, during the post-colonial years, these countries have been saying that don't lecture us. But if you have to listen to us, offer any constructive suggestions if you like, but that's about it. Get out of here. But I think it's a mindset of lecturing people um, on the point that the United States allowed China to rise is it's there is a long history one has to get into, but I think it's misplaced. China played an equally important role in allowing greater growth in the United States. And that came at the expense of the Europeans. I mean, growth in the post 1990s phase in Europe slowed down precisely because China rose. I mean, it's more complicated than that because German industries were also clocking greater growth because they exported a lot of machineries and parts initially. I mean, now some of them have been replaced by Chinese production themselves. But by and large, growth in the neoliberal phase in Europe slowed down because there was an interlocking between the United States and China. But it also allowed the United States to maintain its hegemony because of the rise of its financial power. So in the 1990s, the early 1990s, the US banks were very small. The US banks, in fact, were very local in nature. It was in 1994, the Real Legal Interstate Banking and Branching Act was passed that allowed the local banks to now go national and get bigger. And all of that culminates in 1991, the repeal of the Glass-Steagall, which allowed the commercial banks now to merge with the investment banks and the insurance companies, which led to the rise of all these massive, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, Goldman Sachs, Citibank groups, and so on and so forth, that dominated the globe. And it's not just the banks, it's also the non-banking institutes. So as late as 1993, there never existed a significant alternative asset management class. So there was no active um, uh, venture capital market. There was no active hedge fund managers. Um, And the private equity. So we see a tremendous rise of the BlackRocks and the Vanguards, the different Citadel LLC, this hedge fund managers, private equity, the venture capital in Silicon, precisely because they were able to over financialize. And part of the reason they were able to over financialize is that Chinese exports of capital, which meant that all the reserve assets of China was plugged into the treasury market, which meant that the United States could easily, cheaply borrow from the international market, which allowed it to push back the interest rates. If not for the lowering of those interest rates, the financial power couldn't have expanded and couldn't have dominated the world. Maybe we wouldn't have had the global financial crisis. That's a different counterfactual. But you wouldn't have seen the $10 trillion asset manager like BlackRock, $10 trillion asset manager like Vanguard, huge, corporate entities like the Magnificent Seven and so on and so forth. Without this transformation, where export of cheaper Chinese goods kept inflation lower, which meant that Fed could keep on pushing interest rates lower. And the US could have this unusual borrowing, which allowed it to have so much of fiscal stimulus, which the Europeans couldn't have it. And the part of the region that European growth slowed down was, of course, they couldn't dominate finance like the United States did. But the other side is that they couldn't rely on fiscal stimulus the way United States could did. And the United States could do that because of its easy access to foreign reserve coming from China and the cheaper goods coming from China. So this is just so ridiculous to say that we allowed China. Even if you allowed to rise, you allowed it to rise because it was in your interest. You became the financial power of the world through which now the domination was possible instead of domination through industrial goods.
This perception though is something that I do believe it will stay for the foreseeable future in the United States and Europe, and somehow the rest of the world needs to deal with the fact that these two entities are so or these two spaces of world politics are so self-absorbed. Now, like from the analysis you just did, what are your thoughts on the current approach of the United States of taking a sledgehammer and basically kicking away the fundaments that it built itself in global financial markets? What's your take?
I mean, where this would lead to, it's hard to predict because there are so many different conflicts, and which side win it's hard to estimate. But we can say this, that this is part of uh, the strategy to contain China. The writing is very clear that China is rising very rapidly, and it is becoming an alternative to U.S. hegemony. And the rise of China is very different from the rise of Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was much more contained. Its role in the international sphere was very different in the realm of politics. Economically speaking, the success of the Soviet Union was limited to its domestic spheres. But that's not China. China is creating alternative payment system, alternative social media, alternative investment patterns. Of course, it is a leader in trade and industry, and so it does create a huge challenge. Some of the challenges are, of course, misunderstood. For instance, I don't think there is Chinese would ever be able to challenge the United States in financial power because you don't have a financial class in China altogether because the stock market is heavily repressed through massive share of the state financial institutions. Even you don't have these hedge fund managers and the private equity players and so on. That is controlled. The top tier of the Brodelian sphere of anti-market OPEC caps top tier of capital is controlled by the state very heavily. And so they don't have these alternatives. But in terms of real infrastructure, they do have these alternatives. So I think why we are seeing this is very clear. It is to contain China. But to say where it would lead to is very difficult because there are just so many conflicts of interest. I mean, the reason why a massive mandate through which Trump came to power, even he was forced into uh, putting his aggressive tariff wars into cold storage with the rest of the world was because the bond vigilantes had responded very reactively. And no one is above them. Even President Trump came out and said that I was listening to the bond market. It's a tough spot. They're very hard to contain. I mean, bond vigilantes are saying that, look, PIMCO and others, and we don't know big players in the London market, also the central banks in China. I mean, a 50 basis point rise in the interest rate, 10-year treasury yield, which happened for the first time in many years, means billions and billions of dollars in even $2 trillion that the United States needs in terms of budgetary deficits every year. Forget about the trillions of dollars, 130% of GDP of debt that it already has, which means that a rise in its treasury yield means just so much more than the caricature that Elon Musk and the Doge are doing of saving like maybe 100 billion or 60 billion. I mean, their numbers keep on changing, but they are just peanuts. A rise in 10 basis points in the treasury yield would more than compensate all these efforts. So you cannot overstep. You cannot go beyond the bounds of the bond vigilantes. And then there is an equal component within the stock market. I mean, hedge fund managers and others, Ken Griffin from Citadel LLC are now openly saying that it's just so stupid. And they were Republican donors. They said that this is just so stupid. We cannot bring back manufacturing the way we are talking about, because there are multiple surveys that show that the Americans don't want to do some of the jobs that the Chinese would do because there is just different levels of income. And even multinational corporations, Nvidia and Apple, they're extremely reliant on their operations in China, to Taiwan in China. And they are not very happy about that. And finally, the donor class. The donor class in the tech sector that heavily invested in Trump campaign. Trillions of assets are being wiped off because of the uncertainty created by this. And they would not be happy if this continues. I mean, Elon Musk's net worth has dropped by 25%. I mean, he might be happy because he is given extra business perks, but others would not be happy. So if the assets of donor class don't bounce back, it might be the case that there would be a business coup against Trump, and Trump would be dislodged from power, starting with the midterm 2 years from now, and then eventually he has to go. He has to be replaced by the Democrats or whoever, or it should be the interest of these elites.
One of the guests I had on my show, Cameron McGregor, he pointed out just how total the financialization of the US economy has become, and that, the capital of capitalism was basically sucked out, in the sense that in the traditional capitalist theory, surplus is reinvested into the economy in order then to build infrastructure and so on, and build the wealth of a nation. But in his interpretation, financialization sucked that out and put everything into basically a casino where it's
Right.
where you can make trillions, or generate trillions, but they're all on paper. While the actual infrastructure and so on then crumbles, and because the United States is not an industrial power anymore, it's a financial power, but that's highly artificial. Do you share that assessment, and do you think that this financier class in the United States actually has so much influence that it will prevent systemic change to the setup of the U.S. economy?
Yes, I think I share the analysis about crippling infrastructure, about the casino, that a lot of these are multiplied on papers by, basically escalating risks, creating more money, and so on and so forth. At the expense of stability and at the expense of investments in real infrastructure and human capital and so on. I think where I might diverge a little bit about is the actual power of this financial class. I think there is a large chunk of people on my side, politically and economically speaking, who says that the power of this financial class is just like a paper tiger. I mean, they don't actually hold too much power. I don't agree with them. I think they hold enormous power. I mean, just imagine BlackRock with $10 trillion. There are just two countries whose gross domestic product is more than 10 trillion. There are just two countries in the world whose and that is gross domestic product, which no one entity controls. This is controlled by a handful of people. $10 trillion, they are a professional asset manager that controls $10 trillion of money. So their decisions to move money from one place to another changes interest rates, changes Fed's policy, whether they would go for a cut in the interest policy. They enormously change public decisions, public policies, where investment goes, and so on and so forth. I mean, you can go on and on. How they are able to influence power within the political and economic establishment. Even think about Trump coming to power with this massive landslide. Part of the reason was because he got a $250 million check by Elon Musk. And part of that is X, part of that is the $250 million, which meant that even politics has been totally hijacked by money. How do you explain the ridiculous, I mean, how ridiculous far right shift in the US politics when it comes to the question of Palestine? It is because of the Zionist money. It is because of apart from the strategic interest, it's the money that controls. Even the universities towing the line of the Zionist lobby, because they hold a lot of assets that they control. So I think my assessment is that this financial class is extremely powerful. I am not seeing a decline of their power. Um, whether there would be an economic downturn, I think it will be. I mean, United States would enter a much slower phase of growth unless and until they reverse it. But if the question is about the power of the financial class, my assessment is that they are continue to be the most dominant and powerful groups in the global economy, and I don't think there is any alternative. I don't think China offers an alternative in terms of financial class.
Should it though? I mean, do you think that China as the a systemic rival of the United States and maybe Russia in to another degree, that they should provide this kind of financialization of for global markets, or is it essential to not do that in order to maintain a industrial base the way they have it? Because in a sense, the argument is that this financialization hollowed out the industrial base of the US.
I mean, China can provide essential capital to the global south, and the Belt and Road is one example of that. And I think that is something we need, because they can go into infrastructure, they can build transportation, they can create jobs through investments. I mean, those things are very much in the realm of possibility, and I think those things would emerge. It can also lend money to nations who are struggling with balance of payments. So it can come up as an alternative to IMF. I mean, there would be some time to evolve institutions that can replace IMFs. And the problem, however, is that these massive, giant institutions that the United States have created, the hedge fund managers, the venture capital funds, the private equity funds, or even the traditional asset managers, the pension funds and the mutual funds, they don't exist on the Chinese side, because Chinese side banks control a heavy amount of credit, and they funnel it into the state-owned enterprises. That's it. The corporations rely on their internal financing. So it's a saving-based corporation model. They plow back their investments to industrialize and then trade. Household savings is very moderate in China. Sometimes we are very casual in saying that China is a saving based. The savings come from corporations. So what you don't see there is a tremendous ballooning of consumer credit, tremendous ballooning of the kind of housing market that has been correlated with the repo market and so on. That led to the rise of these massive institutions that dominate the world. So my take is that if we are talking about real development, I do think countries in the BRICS can come together and create genuine real development. But if we are talking about eroding financial power, um, it's very difficult for the BRICS nation. I mean, think about the surplus. It is only China that has significant current account surplus. Most of the BRICS countries are current account deficits. India has some reserves. I mean, India has a huge reserve actually, maybe to the tune of 400. Where does it come from? Not from current account surplus, but from capital account. And where are this capital account surplus coming from? From the pension funds and the mutual funds and hedge funds and the venture capital from the West. So how would India provide finance to the rest of the world when it itself is in a it is itself runs a current account deficit? How can Brazil provide essential capital to others when it itself relies on others? So it's only the PRC that has some surplus capital. I mean, and but even that surplus capital is funneled in very different ways. It's the reserve assets queues. Now PRC is usually gradually becoming a big player in FDI outflow. So through all the Belt and Road and infrastructure development, there is a lot of FDI that flows out. But China doesn't have these institutions to replace the asset managers, and that's where I think I don't see China taking over the financial power. I don't think they should. I don't think they should care about it. Because that has been, as you said, it hollows out your industries. It would make your infrastructure cripple. It would even bankrupt the Communist Party. It would even throw you away from socialism. I mean, there would be severe part of the reason why in the 1990s they moved very cautiously. They kept the credit market extremely repressed. Is that they knew that the moment we liberalize it fully, the capital account, there would be these alternative institutions that emerge that would directly topple our government. Uh, and a Communist Party cannot survive in these dynamics. So I don't think China should do that, and I don't think China would do that. Uh, how the West would go, anyone's guess. Whether they would die a slow death, whether better politics would replace it, I don't know. But yes, the rise of Asia is unstoppable, and it should be unstoppable because we have majority of the population there. So if you are thinking that some, 300 to 400 million people should have greater stake of the world pie than 1.5 billion people in South Asia. That's extremely unreasonable. And so I think rise of Asia is definite. Where the US would go, I don't know.
Yeah, and it's a good thing. It's a good thing. Having not just a couple of hundred millions, but having a couple of billions of people in the middle class and economic weight with that is a good thing. So I think we should look forward to this. And Jyotishman, you're one of the people who's constantly giving us updates on what's happening. People who want to follow you should, of course, follow your channel, India and Global Left. Is there anywhere else where you publish or where people should find you?
We have started a Substack where we bring our long format analysis of current events around the world. So do subscribe that. Our YouTube is the main channel, and we have a bunch of social media attached to our YouTube channel, which is available in our YouTube channel. So yes, that's our main platform, India and Global Left.
I'll put the link into the description. And Jyotishman Mudiar, thank you very much for your time today.
Thanks so much, Pascal. It was a really nice conversation.